is exploding.
Playing the wrong record on the air in the 1960s could end your broadcasting career permanently. Radio stations pulled songs without listening to them. The FBI opened criminal investigations into rock and roll records. The Vatican issued formal condemnations. Governments across multiple continents rushed to ban a single track from their airwaves within days of its release. These were not fringe reactions. These were organized institutional responses from the most powerful establishments in the world, all of them terrified of what was coming out of recording studios. This is the countdown of the 10 most scandalous songs of the 1960s. Every entry on this list generated real consequences: banned airplay, federal investigations, career-defining confrontations, and cultural fights that are still being talked about 60 years later. Stay until number 1, because the most banned song on this entire list contains zero offensive content. The only word that got it pulled from the air in entire regions of the United States is in the title, and that word is God. Let's get into it. 10. Louie Louie, The Kingsmen, 1963. The early 1960s were still operating on the cultural assumptions of the 1950s. Rock and roll was broadly viewed by the adult establishment as a dangerous fad that was actively corrupting American teenagers. That anxiety was real, widespread, and looking for a target. It found one in Louie Louie. The Kingsmen recorded their version in a primitive studio. Lead singer Jack Ely had to yell up at a microphone hanging from the ceiling. The result was raw, imperfect, and almost entirely unintelligible, which is the single most important fact in this entire story. The band thought they had a decent party record. They moved on. High school students across America began filling in the blanks themselves. The invented lyrics they circulated were explicit, graphic, and had absolutely nothing to do with what was actually in the song. But the rumors spread fast enough and far enough that parents, religious organizations, and community leaders began demanding the song be pulled from radio immediately. The outcry reached the federal government. The FBI opened an official investigation into Louie Louie. Agents spent 2 years analyzing the recording at multiple speeds. They interviewed members of the Kingsmen under oath. The Bureau's official conclusion: the lyrics were unintelligible at any speed, and no obscene content could be confirmed. The governor of Indiana personally declared the song pornographic. Local radio stations across the country refused to touch it out of institutional fear rather than any documented evidence of harm. The band made the song a massive hit. The controversy generated more attention than any normal chart run could have produced. Louie Louie became an anthem of teenage rebellion, specifically because the adults were so visibly afraid of it, despite the FBI's own findings that there was nothing there to be afraid of. It is the most literal possible example of censorship, creating the very cultural moment it was trying to prevent. 9. 8 Miles High, The Beards, 1966. Roger McGuinn wrote 8 Miles High about a transatlantic flight. The band had traveled to London, and McGuinn was trying to capture the specific, disorienting experience of being in a commercial aircraft at altitude. The view, the sensation, the foreignness of it. The musical approach was new, a jangly, raga-influenced guitar sound that borrowed from Indian classical music and John Coltrane's jazz work simultaneously. The establishment read one word in the title and stopped there. In 1966, the word high carried a primary association for radio programmers and the organizations that monitored broadcast content. Key industry publications and tip sheets, the publications that radio station programmers relied on for guidance, began labeling 8 Miles High a drug song. They recommended immediate bans across all stations as a protective measure. Many stations complied without ever playing the record once. They banned it based on the tip sheet recommendation alone. The Beards pushed back publicly and consistently, insisting the song was about aviation and nothing else. The band's explanation was accurate. The damage was already done. The band cut directly into the song's chart momentum at the moment it needed airplay most. 8 Miles High should have been a top 10 hit by any measure of its quality and the band's commercial standing at the time. The institutional response to a single word in the title prevented that. The broader consequence extended past the Byrds. The establishment had demonstrated it was actively searching for drug references, real or imagined, in rock records. Every band recording in 1966 and after received that message clearly. 8. Street Fighting Man. The Rolling Stones, 1968. 1968 is the year that requires the most context of any year on this list. The Vietnam War was escalating and generating massive organized protest. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August became the site of police violence against protesters that was broadcast on national. Mick Jagger was in London watching police clash with anti-war demonstrators in the streets. He took that energy directly into the recording studio. Street Fighting Man has an unusual sonic texture. Keith Richards recorded the acoustic guitar parts onto a small cassette recorder to introduce natural distortion into the signal, a deliberate production choice that gave the track a raw, almost lo-fi aggression despite being built on acoustic instruments. The rhythm is tribal and grinding. The lyrics read as a direct address to a generation that wanted action and wasn't sure what form it should take. Major radio stations in Chicago, New York, and other large U.S. cities banned it immediately upon release. The stated concern was that the song could function as a call to action, that playing it over the air during a period of urban unrest could directly incite violence. For the Rolling Stones, this was not a setback. It was confirmation. They had been moving away from their blues band origins towards something harder and more politically confrontational. The institutional fear that Street Fighting Man generated validated exactly the direction they were heading. The band made them more dangerous in the public perception, which was precisely the brand they were building. Street Fighting Man proved that a rock record could make an entire government infrastructure nervous. That is a different category of power chart success. Yes. 7. Puff the Magic Dragon. Peter, Paul, and Mary, 1963.
Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea.
Paul and Mary were the respectable face of the early 1960s folk revival. Adults trusted them. Children listened to them. They were not a provocative act by any reasonable standard. Puff the Magic Dragon was based on a poem written by Leonard Lipton, a college student, and set to music by Peter Yarrow. The song tells the story of a dragon and his young companion, Jackie Paper, and the inevitable sadness that arrives when Jackie grows up and leaves childhood behind. It is melancholy, sincere, and by any direct reading of the text, about the loss of innocence. The reinterpretation came years after the original release, as drug culture became more visible in mainstream American life, and a new vocabulary of slang attached itself to common words. Urban legend assigned meaning to every element of the song. Puff as smoking, Jackie Paper as rolling papers, the land of Hona Lee as a drug-induced state. None of this was in the original poem or the song. The band denied these readings publicly and repeatedly for years. The bans were not immediate, but they were severe when they arrived. Conservative community leaders, parent organizations, and religious groups demanded radio stations pull the track. Entire broadcast chains eventually complied. The song was characterized as a coded attempt to introduce children to drug culture through deceptively innocent-sounding material. This entry on the list is the clearest documented example of establishment paranoia manufacturing scandal from nothing. A genuinely innocent song about childhood and grief was reconstructed through the lens of institutional fear into something it had never been. The band was baffled throughout. The damage to their airplay was real regardless. 6. Eve of Destruction, Barry Maguire, 1965.
The Eastern world, it is exploding.
Barry Maguire did not have a polished voice. He had a raw, raspy, straining instrument that sounded like a man genuinely angry about what he was saying. In 1965, that was exactly the right delivery for what P.F. Sloan had written. Eve of Destruction was recorded in a single session. Maguire practically shouted the lyrics. The production was quick and deliberately unpolished. The song listed, in direct and specific terms, every major crisis point in contemporary American life: Vietnam, nuclear threat, racial violence, political hypocrisy, the contradiction of being old enough to die in a war but not old enough to vote. It was the antithesis of a calculated pop record. It was a document of 1965 anxiety recorded before anyone had a chance to reconsider whether it was commercially viable. The establishment's response was organized and widespread. Media chains across the United States instructed their stations not to play it. The song was characterized as unpatriotic and subversive. Radio programmers pushed an answer song, a direct response record promoting patriotism, obedience, as the preferred alternative. In certain regions, Eve of Destruction was functionally impossible to find on the radio. The suppression backfired completely. The song became essential listening precisely because the people trying to silence it made clear they were afraid of it. It reached the top of the charts despite the institutional resistance, which only made the authorities more furious. Eve of Destruction marked a specific historical transition, the moment when mainstream pop music was no longer operating inside an established comfort zone. It was political, it was angry, and it was a hit. The establishment had no adequate response to that combination. 5 Je t'aime, Moi non plus, Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin, 1969. Most entries on this list involve the establishment misreading something innocent as dangerous. This one does not. Serge Gainsbourg was a French musician who was not interested in coded language or plausible deniability. Je t'aime, Moi non plus is a dialogue between two lovers. Jane Birkin's contribution to the recording includes audible breathing and sounds that left no interpretive ambiguity about the nature of what was being depicted. The lyrics are a direct discussion of physical desire. Nothing is metaphorical. Nothing requires decoding. The institutional response was immediate and essentially universal. The Vatican issued a formal public condemnation of the record, not a suggestion, a direct denouncement from the Catholic Church's central authority. Governments across Europe moved to ban it from broadcast. The BBC added it to its permanent ban list without extended deliberation. It was considered categorically unsuitable for any public airwaves. The ban produced the opposite of its intended effect. The record sold millions of copies globally. The controversy generated the kind of attention that no amount of promotional spending could have purchased. Je t'aime became a worldwide commercial phenomenon specifically because the most powerful moral authorities in Europe lined up to condemn it publicly. The song's legacy is that it demonstrated what was actually possible in 1969. If an artist was willing to test the absolute limits, what mainstream culture would tolerate. The limits turned out to be further than the establishment believed, and closer than the establishment could accept. 4. A Day in the Life, The Beatles, 1967. By 1967, the Beatles were the most commercially successful and culturally influential band on Earth. The BBC was the most authoritative public broadcaster in the United Kingdom. The collision between them over a single track from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band produced one of the most scrutinized censorship decisions in broadcasting history. A Day in the Life was a studio construction of genuine ambition. John Lennon and Paul McCartney contributed separate song sections that were edited together. The track features a 40-piece orchestra performing an unconventional ascending passage, a final E major chord sustained across 3 pianos, and a harmonium for nearly a full minute, and production techniques that had not been previously attempted on a mainstream pop record. The BBC's leadership identified 2 lines in the lyrics as unacceptable. Lennon's phrase, "I'd love to turn you on," and a McCartney reference to having a smoke were ruled to be coded drug references that glorified drug culture. The BBC banned the song from broadcast. The Beatles disputed this characterization directly and publicly. The argument was straightforward. The song was a serious artistic work and deserved to be heard as such. The BBC held its position, asserting its obligation as a public broadcaster to exercise content standards. The practical effect of the ban was limited. Sgt. Pepper was already in millions of households. Anyone who wanted to hear A Day in the Life could hear it without the BBC's involvement. What the ban actually accomplished was demonstrating that the establishment's authority to suppress had a ceiling, and that ceiling was lower than the establishment wanted to admit. The Beatles were too embedded in British cultural life for a broadcast ban to mean what it would have meant 5 years earlier. 3. The End, The Doors, 1967. The Doors were not part of the peace and love current of the 1960s counterculture. They came from a darker and more psychologically confrontational place. Jim Morrison was a poet who was drawn specifically to themes of death, consciousness, and transgression. The End began its life as a relatively straightforward farewell song. It did not stay that way. The studio recording on the Doors' debut album runs 11 minutes. The track builds through a long, hypnotic instrumental structure before arriving at a climactic spoken section, a psychodrama that Morrison constructed around some of the most disturbing imagery ever committed to a major label recording. The specific incident that created the band's reputation for genuine danger happened at a live performance at the Whiskey A Go Go on Sunset Strip. Morrison improvised an extended version of the climactic section that was significantly more explicit than what would eventually appear on the album. The club owner fired the band on the spot immediately after the performance ended. No recording of that specific performance is confirmed to exist. The album version was edited for radio purposes, producing a shorter version that removed the most controversial passages. Even so, most radio stations would only air the edited version, and many refused to play any version at all. The full 11-minute track was essentially absent from commercial radio. The End established something important about the Doors as a band. Jim Morrison's provocations were not performance. They were not calculated for marketing purposes. They were genuine expressions of where his writing took him, and the institutional response to that was real fear rather than manufactured. Controversy. 2. Let's Spend the Night Together, The Rolling Stones, 1967. The Ed Sullivan Show in 1967 was the most important television platform available to any band that wanted national exposure in the United States. Sullivan's audience was enormous, and his standards of conduct were well established. Appearing on the show required compliance with his content rules. The Rolling Stones were scheduled to perform their current single. Let's Spend the Night Together is not subtle. The title is a direct statement of intent. The lyrics follow through on the premise of the title without deflection. Sullivan's producers determined that the song title and its implications were not permissible on national broadcast television. They demanded the band change the word night to sometime for the performance. The Rolling Stones initially refused. The network's response was to threaten cancellation of the performance and permanent exclusion from the show. The commercial logic of that threat was real. Losing Ed Sullivan access had cost bands significant mainstream exposure in the recent past. Mick Jagger ultimately agreed to the change. The band performed the edited version live in front of the full national audience. Jagger complied with every word of the demand. He also rolled his eyes, visibly and deliberately, into the camera every time he sang the forced substitution. Millions of viewers watched that eye roll in real time. The performance is now studied as a specific moment in the history of broadcast censorship because of what Jagger demonstrated, that an artist could be compelled to change the words while making it completely clear to the audience that the compulsion was happening. The compliance was total. The defiance was total. Both were visible simultaneously to everyone watching. Sullivan got the version he demanded. The Rolling Stones got something more durable, documented proof, broadcast to the entire country, that they had been forced to play by someone else's rules and had not pretended otherwise. 1. God Only Knows, the Beach Boys. 1966. God Only Knows contains no violence, no sexual content, no drug references real or imagined, no political subversion, no provocative imagery of any kind. Brian Wilson's constructed it as a love song. The production is intricate and layered, harpsichord. Unusual chord voicings, complex vocal harmonies built across multiple interlocking parts. The arrangement is sophisticated enough that Paul McCartney has publicly called it the greatest song ever written. The lyrics are a direct and sincere expression of devotion. There is nothing in the text that could generate controversy under any reasonable reading. The word that got it banned across entire regions of the United States is the first word of the title. In 1966, using the word God in the title of a secular pop single was, in certain parts of the country, an act that conservative broadcasters and religious organizations would not accept. This was not a hymn. It was not gospel music operating within established religious frameworks. It was a Beach Boys record on Capitol Records being played on commercial pop radio alongside rock and roll and rhythm and blues. Radio stations across the American South and parts of the West banned the record immediately. The stated justification was blasphemy, that using God's name in the context of a pop song trivialized the divine. Religious organizations and conservative DJs argued the title itself was disrespectful, regardless of content. God Only Knows is now consistently listed among the greatest recordings in the history of popular music. The BBC, which had its own complicated relationship with banned records throughout this decade, selected it as the greatest song ever recorded in a 2002 poll of music industry professionals. The fact that it was banned from American radio for using the word God in its title is not a footnote to its legacy. It is central to understanding what the 1960s establishment was actually afraid of. Not obscenity, not political radicalism in this case, not drugs. The fear, at its most fundamental, was of a generation defining its own relationship to language, culture, and meaning, and doing it through music that the previous generation had no framework to control. From the FBI investigating a party record to the Vatican condemning a pop single, the 1960s establishment spent an enormous amount of institutional energy trying to suppress music it couldn't understand and couldn't stop. Every ban on this list failed. Every one of these songs outlasted the people who tried to bury them. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when the thing being suppressed is actually worth fighting for. Which of these bans is the most absurd to you looking back? Drop it in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay curious.